So today's band was blowing up radio and arenas when their frontman passed away in a most horrible fashion. These guys were on the up and up. This band was devastated. They had no idea what they were going to do next. Now, little did they know that in the form of a very large bell, a supernatural visit from their dead singer, and a new singer that said he could write lyrics, but then battled writer's block for months, and all this band would create the biggest selling rock record in history. It sold 50 million copies today, but it never went to number one. It didn't contain any hit singles either. And it had a perfectionist producer who spent months recording just to get a drum sound for one song. But here's the thing. Even with all those hours recording and 15 mics capturing the sound of this large bell, that the band had commissioned to be the backbone of one of the album's most famous tracks, to this day, the band has never been able to capture the exact sound of the bell on this recording when they play it live. Coming up next, the story of the biggest selling rock record ever and the uphill battle to get it right and out to the masses, and also trying to solve the mystery of who really wrote these classic songs. The dead singer or his replacement? Let's find out. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. If you chose a side in the VHS versus Betamax argument back in the day, if you even know what that is, you're going to dig this channel of pure nostalgia. Make sure that you subscribe below right now. Click the big red button. Also click that bell so that you get our latest and greatest. We also have a Patreon. You're going to want to check that out where we're putting up full-length interviews there. Check it out today. So I'm excited today to get into the story behind the opening track of the biggest selling rock and roll album in history, acdc's Take No Prisoners, Spare No Lives tribute to the late great Bon Scott, Hell's Bells. Just weeks into the recording of acdc's landmark album Back in Black, newly hired lead singer Brian Johnson was suffering from writer's block. It was the spring of 1980, and the band had gathered at Compass Point Studios in the Bahamas. The Young brothers, Malcolm and Angus, they were furiously churning out new material for the record at breakneck speeds. Just as Brian finished the lyrics to one song, the brothers were right there with another riff ready to go. Finally, one morning, Brian Johnson hit the wall. Or as he described it, he was dead in the head. In his newly released memoirs, Johnson recounted what happened next. I'll just paraphrase what he said there. Got to pick that up. It's a great book. Outside, there were black clouds that were forming on the horizon, and soon a storm was raging over the ocean. About this time, there was a knock on the door of Johnson's guest house, and when he opened it, he saw legendary producer Mutt Lange, a certifiable musical genius if there was one. Lange had produced acdc's previous album, Highway to Hell, and was on the island with them to helm the sequel. The second that Brian Johnson opened the door, Mutt saw the look on his face. And he said, "What's the matter, Brian?" "I'm struggling here, Mutt. I've just got a bit of writer's block. That's all." As Mutt stood there in the open doorway, he thought for a moment and he asked, "Are you stuck on anything in particular?" Brian said he was working on a new riff from Malcolm. It was called Hell's Bells. Just then, somewhere in the distance, there was a loud, earth-shaking roar. "That's rolling thunder," said Lange. It was an expression that Brian Johnson hadn't heard before, but instantly something within him clicked, and Mutt could see it in Brian's eyes. "There you go," he said, "your first line." After that, it started dumping rain. Pouring rain is what Brian said. "And listen to that wind," said Mutt. "It's coming on like a hurricane," is what Brian said. And boom, that was it. acdc's newly anointed lyrics off and running. Okay, maybe the conversation didn't go exactly like that, is what Brian Johnson said, but it was pretty close to that. The opening lines of Hell's Bells practically wrote themselves on the spot, paving the way for what would be one of the most unforgettable opening tracks to one of the biggest albums of the rock era. Actually, the biggest selling rock and roll album, if you're saying just pure rock and roll. Because, Thriller's not a rock album. I'm, of course, talking about Back in Black. And it was all about Bon Scott, acdc's first lead singing legend. According to Angus, the Back in Black's all-black cover was a sign of mourning for Bon. But the band also wanted it to be a celebration of Scott. Originally, Atlantic Records resisted the concept of a black cover, but they eventually acquiesced when the band agreed to have their logo outlined in gray. It was February 19th, 1980, when tragedy struck. Bon Scott was discovered dead in the back of a friend's car in London after a heavy night of partying. The official cause of Scott's death was, of course, classified as alcohol poisoning and death by misadventure. Now, past installments, we've taken a close look at the events surrounding Bon's death, so I won't go into great detail here. But you can get the rest of the story if you check out our episodes on You Shook Me All Night Long and also Back in Black. Now, it goes without saying, but the loss of Bon Scott was absolutely devastating, and acdc seriously contemplated breaking up. However, Bon's close friends and family, particularly Bon's father, encouraged the band to find a new lead singer and just keep going. After a lot of deliberation, the guys decided to actively pursue a new lead singer after Bon's funeral. acdc ultimately hired ex-Geordie frontman Brian Johnson, and they made the official announcement on April 1st, 1980. Brian Johnson proved to be the perfect addition for this ascending band. Now, Back in Black was released on July 25th of 1980. Great way to start out the 80s. There's no doubt this is one of the most important albums ever released in the rock era. acdc, of course, was already on the rise with their previous record, Highway to Hell, before Back in Black had been their bestseller. But Back in Black would overtake it by a long shot on its way to selling an estimated 50 million copies worldwide. Like I said, the biggest selling rock album worldwide. The Brian Johnson debut peaked at number 4 on the Billboard album charts, and it remained there for the next year and a half. The first single from Back in Black was the incomparable rocker, You Shook Me All Night Long. Other singles would include Rock and Roll Ain't Noise Pollution, Back in Black, of course, the title track, and today's featured song, Hell's Bells. Again, such a great book here, but Johnson points out in his biography that there have been some controversy surrounding the authorship of some of the songs on Back in Black. This is another topic we've examined in previous episodes. Today I want to give Brian Johnson the last word, the final word on all of this. This is what he said in his recent biography. Now, what Brian Johnson said is the conspiracy theories are legion, usually started by people who think that they know what happened, but weren't there. That includes one journalist in Australia who claimed that Bon Scott had already scribbled most of the words to this album in one of his notebooks before he died. But no, it was me at the end of the pen, writing every night and every morning with only the title to work with. End of quote. Brian explained that his daily writing process culminated when they met up with Mutt Lange in the studio each morning. This was around 11 a.m. I guess every band member had an appointed time to be there to record their parts. So Brian would give him what he had written, and as I noted earlier, things were moving really fast. There was a lot of pressure on Brian Johnson coming into this band. But he said that at the same time, it was also very, very exciting. Anyway, after Johnson turned in his day's homework, Mutt would photocopy the lyrics and give a copy to an engineer named Tony Platt. And then Brian would record his vocals, and Mutt would take some notes, and that was pretty much it. Brian would say that every line, every word on Back in Black was written with an overnight deadline. There was no time to second guess anything. Like the album itself, Hell's Bells was written to be a tribute to Bon Scott. Brian Johnson credited the brothers Young for coming up with the idea, though. He said, that was definitely Mal and Ang. They wanted something symbolic, for whom the bell tolls or whatever. Malcolm Young said, we were talking about the Hell's Bells intro, and it was a really good intro. It was really ominous. Angus had the title Hell's Bells. When asked about the remainder of the writing process, Brian Johnson insinuated that it was something of a supernatural experience. After that initial lightning strike of inspiration with Mutt Lange that we talked about earlier, Brian would later sit down and hash out the rest of this song. Explaining what came next, Brian said, "Now, I don't believe in God or heaven or hell, but something happened. We have these little rooms, like cells with a bed and a toilet, no TVs. I had this big sheet of paper and I had to write some words. I was going, oh, frick." And I'll never forget, I just went. I started writing and I never stopped. And that was it. Hell's bells. I had a bottle of whiskey and I kept the light on all night, man. Those were his words. Also, in a documentary for VH1, Brian Johnson said during the writing of the record that he was paralyzed with fear. Praying for guidance, he revealed that he experienced a supernatural event regarding Bon Scott that he was reluctant to go into detail about. He did later admit that one night he was woken up out of a dead sleep and was inspired to sit and write lyrics down as fast as he could put them down on paper. Sounds like a supernatural experience involving Bon Scott there. Amazing. Also, talking about praying for guidance, there's a little bit of a contradiction there since he said he didn't believe in God or heaven or hell, but maybe he changed his mind, I don't know. The track opens with the infamous tolling of a church bell, which may be reminiscent of a funeral, but also served as signal that something massive was on the horizon. The bell rings out 4 times before that guitar riff hits. And then there are 9 more chimes before it fades out on lucky number 13. After that main riff kicks in, the song begins to build very slowly with Phil's bass drum and cymbals. And then it starts picking up speed. By the time Brian Johnson launches into the vocals, about a minute and a half in, full on rocking. Angus and Malcolm were set on recording an actual church bell for the track. They wanted it to sound as authentic as possible. So Tony Platt was set on a mission back to find the perfect bell in the UK. Tony chose the Denison bell in the Carillion Tower at the Loughborough War Museum. Platt then rented a mobile recording unit and armed with 24 mics, he attempted to get tolling it on tape. However, there were birds living in the bell tower. Every single time it rang, those birds would fly around in a ruckus and they'd chirp and make a lot of noise, and it made the recording completely unusable. But luckily they had a plan B. That plan B, acdc had confirmed the type of bell sound that they wanted. They commissioned a replica of the 4-ton Denison bell. They actually take out on tour with them. But that would actually be too heavy, so the guys would settle for 3 tons lighter. The John Taylor and Co Foundry was chosen for the job. When finished, the 1-ton monster would include the acdc logo and the words Hell's Bell stamped on its side. Since the real Denison bell was a no-go, acdc had the work sped up on their copy. Fortunately, it was finished just in time to meet the album's recording deadline. The Hell's Bell was then hung on a block and tackle, and the man who cast it had the honor of striking it for the track. Since it was so much smaller than the Denison bell, its tone just wasn't right. So Platt brought the recordings to New York's Electrical Lady Studios. There he and producer Mutt Lange figured out the right combination of sounds. For the mix, they slowed the tape down to half speed, and it turned out to be just the foreboding sound that they were looking for. Hell's Bell would, of course, become one of the most iconic stage props in rock and roll history. Right up there with a lot of the stuff that Pink Floyd has done. acdc lugged that massive bronze bell all across the world. Tough break for the roadies. Brian Johnson was the one who had the privilege of ringing it night in and night out with what he called a Thor-like metal sledgehammer. In time, it would be replaced with a fiberglass copy, for concerts. It goes without saying, but that one was considerably lighter than the original. Now, lyrically, Hell's Bells isn't for the faint of heart. The song not only invokes hell, obviously, but also includes references to the Lord of the Inferno himself, with lines like, "I'll give you black sensations up and down your spine, and if you're into evil, you're a friend of mine." Let's just say that that was enough to put it in the crosshairs during the satanic panic of the 80s. Made it a target of the PMRC. I always heard it as a big, bad hard rock song. That's pretty much, I didn't read into it much. Hell's Bells never charted on the Billboard Hot 100 though. Did at least reach number 50 on the mainstream rock chart. It was well under the radar around the world, at least for that time. Which is kind of weird because You Shook Me All Night Long and Back in Black, they both broke into the top 40 on the Hot 100. The first one to number 35 and the next one 37. And it also came from the biggest selling rock album of all time, like I've said. But despite Hell's Bells' lackluster reception on the charts, it's absolutely one of AC/DC's greatest songs, off arguably their best album. And, further proof that while Brian Johnson had some mighty big shoes to fill, he was making his own mark as the new singer of this band, with his gasoline and Nell's hardcore vocal gymnastics. He kept the band just breathing fire. Looking back on the process of writing and recording the first album with AC/DC, Brian Johnson remembers being incredibly relieved when it was all done. Years later, he could still recall that moment vividly. He said, "It was about 3 p.m. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I went outside down to where the huts were. I sat on this wall, and I got a ciggy out, and I sat among the trees. I was so happy that I had done it." End of quote. Well, what he had done was nearly the impossible. I mean, Brian Johnson had come aboard to take that lead mic in a band that was skyrocketing on incredibly short notice. Over the course of just a handful of weeks, he had managed to keep up with this prolific bandmates as they fired off new material left and right, writing lyrics at the drop of a hat, and ultimately putting the finishing touches on one of the biggest selling albums of all time and one of the greatest rock and roll albums ever. That day on the beach when he'd finished his contributions, Brian actually hadn't even heard any of the songs in their entirety. He wouldn't hear what he had accomplished until he got his hands on a finished record, just like the rest of us. It was the first edition, of course. He said after pulling the record from his protective sleeve, he just held it in his hands, just staring at it. Felt like for hours. He was mesmerized by the cover. It was so simple, but so unbelievably cool. I love how he shares this in his book. It feels like we're there. Desperate to hear it, he actually had nothing to play it on. He was at his parents' place and all they had was a radio. So he called up his ex-Geordie bandmate guitarist Derek Rutham. He had a killer sound system, actually. On the other end of the phone, Derek said, "Oh, you're back, are you? What have you been doing all this time?" "Well, if I can come over and use your record player, you can hear for yourself." So a couple hours later, Brian Johnson was in his old bandmate's living room. And Back in Black placed it on the turntable. And as those opening bell chimes were coming on Hell's Bells, as they gave way to Malcolm's riff, Brian just sat there, just as shocked and in awe as the rest of us. All the while he was thinking, this sounds frickin' fantastic. And then he looked over at Derek, his buddy, and he noticed he was frowning and just shaking his head. When the song reached the "Won't Take No Prisoners" line, Derek gasped, "Oh, that's way too high." But as for Brian Johnson and the rest of us, we all knew from the moment that we heard Hell's Bells that it was just the beginning of something very, very special. I mean, rock and roll would never be the same again. This is one of those no-holds-barred, fire-spitting anthems of hard rock, if there ever was one. The opening shot of Brian Johnson's tenure with this legendary band and his mighty vocal swing. This still stings the uptight, and it still rings in our ears all these years later. Thanks so much for watching. Leave us a comment about AC/DC and Hell's Bells. What do you remember about this song? Let us know in the comments, what do you remember the first time you heard Back in Black? Or the first time you've shared it with somebody? If you like acdc's catalog, we got plenty to choose from in our catalog. Highway to Hell, Back in Black, all that good stuff. And make sure to subscribe if you like our videos so you don't miss out. We'd love to have you as part of our community. We're always talking music. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.